I will briefly introduce the speakers of the current panel. Their longer bios are available on our website. We sent everyone the link on the chat function. Our speakers in the current panel are Daniel Bartal, Professor of Psychology from Tel Aviv University, Advocate Ziad Abu Ziad, co-editor of the Palestine-Israel Journal and a former minister in the Palestinian Authority, a legislator and a negotiator. Shiri Krebs, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Law as Protection at Deakin University in Australia. And Dr. Manal Totri-Jubran, Professor of Constitutional Law at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. I'd like to start obviously with Daniel Bartal, our first speaker. And I'd like to ask you two questions and invite you to try to briefly answer them. And the first question, well, first of all, since you are a social psychologist and an expert on the a political psychologist, sorry, and an expert on the Palestine-Israel conflict, I'd like to ask you first, what are the motivations of both sides in this conflict to wage war and atrocities? And the next question, which you can answer in sequence, is, what can we do to counter these motivations for war and atrocity? How can we change them and foster conditions for transitional justice? Thank you very much.
Okay, I will just say first I would like to thank you that I was invited, because it's not really kind of accepted that political psychologists will talk about transitional justice, and I really thank you and all the others for inviting me, because I think that it's impossible to discuss transitional justice without knowing the history of Gaza. No, I don't mean 2000 years ago, but in the range of, let's say, from 48, and the background of the Gaza war, which is a motivation. So I would like to talk a little bit about the background, because Gaza was in the partition plan, was supposed to be in the Arab state. But following the 1948 war, Egypt assumed control of Gaza Strip, and it became a home of a population of Palestinians who were, as we call, refugee, expelled from the country, and it was one of the densely populated area in the world. So it was under the control of Egyptian, and came 1967 war, where Israel conquered a lot of space, territories, and it became Israeli. So between 1967 and 1993, Israel maintained a military presence and control of the Gaza Strip under occupation, as we know, and the aim was to consolidate control over the region. In this time, between 1967 and 2005, we have to know, so Israel constructed 21 Jewish settlements in Gaza Strip, which occupied 20% of the territory, and with 0.2% of population. So, the ratio between the areas that was occupied and the population was unbelievable. And during the first year of occupation, it was very harsh, really. Displacement, expulsion, imprisonment, surveillance, execution, etc., especially under Sharon, who was the commander of this area. I would like to say a few words about Hamas. It was established in 1987 as a kind of welfare helping, assisting Palestinians and fulfills the kind of roles that Shas is fulfilling was fulfilling in Israel. And later in early 90s was established military brigades which took part much in the Second Intifada with terror and in the 2006 election, it should be known that Hamas won the election versus Fatah. But the United States and Israel did not agree with the results, and eventually Mahmoud Abbas annulled the results, and in 2007 was a crash of conflict between Fatah and Hamas. Hamas expelled the Fatah and established really governance over the territory, which became a kind of totalitarian. Following the takeover of Hamas, Israel imposed really very sealed land, air, and sea blockade, a siege, which means the term of occupation was changed. It was under control, where all the ratio of food, what enters, what exit, was controlled by Israel, but it was inside relatively free. Also, Israel also controlled the death and birth of every Palestinian. So during this time, there were some kind of violent encounters, and I would just to mention all of them, where I would like to say to some who did not know that all of them began with the stimulation of Israel. And there were Operation Castlet, Pillar of Defense, Protective Verge, March of Return, and May 21 conflict. In which many Palestinians were killed, injured, and this was the result.
I'm sorry to cut you because I don't want us to finish the time before we get to hear some of your wisdom about the
I
motivation.
am coming. I am coming. So here also someone has to know that Netanyahu paid Hamas dollars transfer from Qatar, and here we are coming to 7th of October. So as you wish. So the questions that are posed were three questions. The first one, why did Hamas launch the October 7 attack? I don't talk about atrocities, will be the second question. But I would like to explain to the audience why did it do it. Wanted to demonstrate ability to plan and execute a sophisticated attack in asymmetric war, conflict if you want, testing Israeli vulnerability and exploiting Israel's internal position, a political division, which was at this time very visible, reinforcing Hamas' position as a dominant force in the Palestinian resistance, undermining the Palestinian Authority. promoting the idea that armed struggle rather than diplomacy yields results, provoking an Israeli overreaction to mobilize global and regional support, discrediting Abu Mazen and PA, presenting them as corrupt and ineffective side, challenging Israeli normalization, which is very important, Arab states, particularly with Saudi Arabia. If you remember in the summer, Saudi Arabia disconnected themselves from the Palestinian really issue, and Palestinians were absolutely lost in the summer of 23 without getting any kind of support to bring the Palestinian issue to world agenda, to place Hamas as a major player and mobilizer in the region, the force other regional forces to intervene. Hope that Hezbollah, Iran, Houthis will enter. Revenge for decades, a blockade, settler violence, and Israeli military operation. Hopelessness and desperation in Gaza, chronic humanitarian crisis, lack of future prospects, and free Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prison. The wish to be martyr and nothing to lose. But then comes a second question. Why did Hamas resort to such atrocious violence? So it could do the attack, but why it was so immoral, so atrocious? The attack should be understood within the dynamic of asymmetric conflict, where a weaker actor challenges a dominant power using unconventional means to shake the Israelis. Surprising is with the attack. Psychological reason, and here I would like to name number of them. Dehumanization and hatred of Israeli Jews, vengeance and brutalization for siege, deprivation, despair, hopelessness, deep sense of victimhood, moral disengagement, denial, and repression. Moral disengagement is separating moral consideration from action, moral entitlement that we as victims, both sides saw themselves as victims, we as victims entitled to perform in a atrocious way in order to really vengeance what happened before, to
Danny,
humiliate.
I wanted to see if you could weave in some of the ways, and if you think at all that there is a way to reverse these motivations. I mean, this is very entrenched and very deep, these motivations, and I wonder if in this context there we're trying to talk about transitional justice. I mean, is there a way to counter these motivations, to maybe
Yes,
find other motivations to spiral out of this sense of victimhood, this disengagement, moral disengagement, etc.?
Sigal, just I want to say one sentence. That I have another question. How Israeli soldiers, and this will be mirror image of the ones that I named before, how Israeli soldiers can kill civilians who are children, mothers, fathers, carry ethnic cleansing, starvation, and flatten, and maybe even genocide. So all the reasons that I listed for Hamas apply also for the Israeli that they did, in addition to some more like obedience of the army, and etc. Now I will come to your question because the situation in Israel, as some of you mentioned, is really, as I say, hopeless. But it's not really hopeless because about 15%, how I calculated, it's really by surveys, are ready for transitional justice. And this is thousands, 100,000 of Jews who are ready to start with transitional justice. I
50,
see
15%.
15%,
One
15,
five.
1 5, right, read. And there are existing NGOs, so it's not barren land. It is something that you can work on this. Uh, so there is a echelon really of the NGOs that are ready to give hand. And I will say what really can be done. No documentation, which is done very well by academia people and by NGOs. I think that we can deal with the trauma that both nations really suffer very much till today. The Palestinians is ongoing for a year and a half, but also Israelis suffer. Humanization of victims of both sides. It's very important work because of the selective uh, documentary that goes on in televisions, Israeli and social media. So it's very important to humanize the victims. I think the placement of the displaced people on both sides is the same problem and can be done. And demand by Israel and the world for state committee investigation, which is very important part for the transitional justice. Netanyahu doesn't want such a committee of investigation, and he wants a very, very light one that does not have a lot of legalized laws. But we should help the 100,000 of Israelis who demand, and there is pressure, should be pressure of external countries, especially Germany, Britain, France, that will press Israeli government with really severe, really steps to start transitional justice steps, which are very, very important.
Thank you very much, Professor Bartal. I really think this was eye-opening, and both the motivations and also the way forward, and stressing that both civil society as well as external actors need to play a role and need to play a role together. Um, I I think it's also important to mention the 15%. This is not zero. This is not 80 either, but there is something to start with. We heard Ruti Taitel also before talk about organizations of civil society. And now our next speaker, Ziad Abu Ziad, is also one of the founders of a civil society joint Palestinian-Israeli initiative, which exemplifies what Professor Bartal talked about, the role of civil society, the role of joint initiatives, those 15% that still believe in the beyond zero-sum game and the humanity of the other. So I would like, without further ado, to pass the floor to Ziad Abu Ziad, please, and with two questions for you as well. And the first is, again, since you are the co-founder of the Palestine-Israel Journal, this joint Palestinian-Israeli civil society organization, I'd like to ask you what, in your view, is the role of civil society organizations, including your own journal, in promoting the different goals of transitional justice in the region? And how can civil society organizations, especially joint Israeli-Palestinian ones, do this? How can they promote? In what tools, what means can they use to promote transitional justice, again, and all its goals, whether it's humanizing the other, providing accountability, documentation, reconciliation, etc. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before I answer your question, allow me just to make a very short comment. Since I accepted the invitation to speak in this conference, I had very conflicted thoughts in my mind whether to continue and to come and participate or not. I have to admit that I accepted the invitation immediately because I was told that my old friend Danny Barta recommended me, and I was happy to share this panel with him. Danielle, it's good to see you. When I see you, I should go and look in the mirror to my face because you look getting much more younger, and maybe me too. Uh, uh, well, another point before answering your question, the disturbing thing here is that we are talking about transitional justice, and transitional justice should deal with a transition from a conflict to a peace era or from a dictatorship to a democracy. In our case, we are in a transitional period from a Nakba and a conflict to a more dangerous and escalating conflict, which is still going on, and nobody can know how it will end. What's happening in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, the destruction of 90% of the urban area, the killing of more than 55,000 people, the injuries of more than 127,000 injuries, the unrestrained war by Netanyahu and the support of the United States, which just yesterday prevented the Security Council from taking a resolution calling for a ceasefire, make us expect the worst. We are witnessing war crimes in Gaza, killings, destruction, expulsion. And I don't know if there is a room now to speak about transitional justice or even transformative justice in relation to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict when we are witnessing a conflict, an endless conflict, which nobody can predict in advance how it will end. Having said this, let me try to answer your question. I think that civil society organizations play a vital role in promoting different goals of transitional justice, particularly in the region. They act as advocates for victims, document the human rights abuses, and can influence policy by mobilizing grassroots support. Some of civil society organizations actively collect information on human rights violations and play a key role in documenting and collecting evidence of human rights violations, which can be used by truth commissions and to identify victims eligible for reparations and the perpetrators of these violations. A large number of Israeli and Palestinian and international human rights organizations have documented violations and submitted reports to the United Nations and courts. And for example, the Israeli organization B'Tselem and the Palestinian organization Al-Mizan and Al-Haq have worked to collect evidence for judicial use. These documentation efforts are an essential part of the truth-telling process and will be a valuable asset for any future truth commission or judicial proceedings. Thus, the role of civil society organizations remain essential in keeping the flame of justice burning. They document collective memory, provide a frame of reference to which the parties can return when the circumstances are right, and give victims a sense that their sufferings is being recognized and acknowledged globally, even if their redress is delayed. Despite the absence of any official mechanism for truth-telling, recent decades have witnessed efforts by some Israeli civil society and academics to bridge the narrative gap. For example, the New Historians movement, which emerged in the 80s, uncovering Israeli documents that shed light on the displacement and massacres of 1948 against the Palestinians, sparking a debate within Israel society about the truth of the Nakba. And organizations such as Zukhrut, which have also collected testimonials about the Nakba and organized awareness-raising tours to displaced Palestinian villages in an effort to break Israeli denial and familiarize them with the Palestinian narrative. Zukhrut describes these efforts as a form of preliminary transitional justice, meaning a set of steps aimed at addressing the past while the conflict continues in preparation for a future transitional phase. This approach relies on the use of tools such as historical facts, education, and community dialogue to achieve a transition from a culture of denial and impunity to one of recognition of responsibility and justice. The activities of these organizations address aspects of truth, memory, and apology informally in what can be considered unofficial truth projects that precede a political solution. On the Palestinian side, civil society initiatives have also sought to engage with Israelis on the level of personal narratives. Peace Coalition Geneva Initiative, the Women's Circle, the Palestine-Israel Journal, which I will talk about later, the Committee to Communicate with the Israeli Side, headed by Mohammed al-Madani, member of the Fatah Central Council, and the Parents Circle organization, which has brought together Palestinian and Israeli families who lost children in the conflict, providing a platform for them to share their stories and emphasize with each other. Such initiatives, although limited in scope, contribute to building a shared human understanding that paves the way for reconciliation when the time comes. Youth and women dialogue and educational projects have also been launched by Palestinian and Israeli NGOs, including the Palestine-Israel Journal, under the auspices of international organizations, aiming to familiarize each side with the other's perspective on history. These efforts face significant political and social obstacles. And let me now say a few words about the Palestine-Israel Journal. And I must say that Daniel Barthal was my partner in this journal. He was the co-editor of Palestine-Israel Journal for a good number of years before he went for a sabbatical year to the United States. The Palestinian Journal, Israel Journal, aims to promote opening channels of communication between academics and other intellectuals, opinion policymakers, and grassroots organizations to voice their views and take part in the public debate for a democratic and just solution to the conflict. The journal publication is conducted in parallel with other related activities, including blogs on the website, internet newsletter, roundtable discussions, public events, policy papers, workshops, and joint projects. To cut the story short, the Palestine-Israel Journal aims to promote better understanding between the two peoples that includes focusing on civil society, a crucial role in peace building and advocating for accountability, providing alternative mechanisms and promoting dialogue and reconciliation, providing a platform for Palestinians and Israeli academics, public figures, journalists, civil society activists, and other experts to take part in the ongoing debate, raising awareness of wider public within both communities about the issues at the crux of the conflict and how they impact the lives of both peoples from the perspective of the other side. Fostering in a climate of constructive criticism and mutual respect, active dialogue and exchanges within and between the two civil societies. To conclude, I would say that achieving transitional justice in Palestine and Israel is a difficult but necessarily tasks. It requires political courage and moral conviction from leaders on both sides to acknowledge painful truths and take responsibility action. It also requires the support and will of the international community to ensure that justice is not merely an option, but an essential component of any solution. It is also important to involve the victims themselves in shaping this process. All must find a place in the narrative of the final solution and in the design of its mechanisms. Some may view the demand for justice in the midst of a bloody conflict as unrealistic ideal, but historical experience suggests that otherwise, that settlements based on turning the page without justice remain fragile. The question is, can justice mechanisms contribute to mutual recognition and reparations, helping lay the foundations for a sustainable peace between Israelis and Palestinians? The answer is yes, if there is the will and courage. Achieving a just and just reconciliation between the two peoples may seem far-fetched today, but the changing circumstances and taking the necessarily preliminary steps, it can become tomorrow's reality. I must end by saying that witnessing the changes in the Israeli society and the shifting of the total Israeli society about right wing and about religious fanaticism and about racism make us very, very little hopeful that this may happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ziad. On a personal note, I would like to thank you for being here with us. Despite the difficulty, the challenges, the emotions, I think it's a very important message that you bear. And despite the hopelessness, to see a slither, like a really, really small chance of hope for TJ, or at least for seeing the other's perspective, and the home that organizations such as your journal provide for engaging across borders, across societies. I think if we lose those places, those convening places for those who still believe in a reconciliation, in a coexistence, closing those venues would be, of course, the end of the story. So we must keep them open and find a way to attract more members in such initiatives for the hope that one day the wall will fall and that we can provide a model for the future leaders to implement transitional justice beyond accountability, more also in the direction of reconciliation. But of course, they go in tandem. So I thank you on a personal level, and I thank you also more generally for enriching this discussion and the audience. Deep, deep, deep gratitude. Thank you so much. I will move to our next speaker, Shiri Krebs. And Shiri, who is an expert on law, but also on the socio-cognitive aspect of society and the combination with justice. And I would like to ask you one question, but a very complex and difficult one, and that is relating to the social cognitive conditions for transitional justice. What are the social cognitive, maybe preconditions, we should say, preconditions that need to be met in order for us to even discuss, conceptualize, think about transitional justice? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sigal. Hello, everyone. It is past midnight here in Nara, Melbourne, and I join you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I recognize their continuing custodianship and connection to land, waters, and communities, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. The idea of custodianship is an idea of care. It reflects connection to natural entities that transcend legal borders or the legal recognition of sovereignty. And by acknowledging country, I also acknowledge the acute need for policies of care, um, and the limitations of formal legal institutions in facing ongoing atrocities. This is a difficult time to discuss justice or transition in Palestine, Israel. As we speak, people in Gaza are being killed in bombings, shootings, demolitions, and starvation, and hostages held by both parties suffer inhumane conditions. I therefore wish to note the immediate need to stop the violence as the first precondition to any discussion of transition. Now, once the violence is stopped, there are other important preconditions for transitional justice in Palestine, Israel. And I will mention three sociocognitive such preconditions. Um, so the first one that I wanted to mention is the imagination of coexistence. And in this space, TJ for Palestine, Israel necessitates imagining a shared future within the small geographic territory of Palestine, Israel. And I think in this sense, this conflict is very different from the transitional justice experience, for example, in South Africa, because, and I think the reason for that is probably the devotion, perhaps on both sides, to the idea of separation, that the Oslo Accords sort of entrenched in a way, because as the ideal became separation, it also gave space and place for dehumanization and an idealization of eradicating of the other. We don't want to see, we don't want to engage, we don't need to learn, we don't need to accept, we don't need to listen. And so the idea of separation, I think, in its core, the idea of a two-stage solution and its core as an idea of separation stands in the way of transition from violence and into more justice and peaceful alternatives. The second precondition that I wanted to mention relates to freedom and equality, because TJ for Palestine, Israel should be designed with mutual recognition of Palestinian and Israelis' rights to life of freedom and dignity and equality in that territory or in that space. And equality in that sense cannot and will not coincide with any preferential treatment. And so the ideal or the idea or the dream of a Jewish and democratic state already frustrates by its own design ideas of full equality and dignity in the mere sense that it already, by definition, includes preferential treatment of one over the other. And the third point or precondition that I wanted to note here is the idea of positive sum thinking, or the opposite of zero sum narratives, which take priority in this conflict and tend to um, entrench processes of dehumanization, legitimation of violence, and a territorial annexation as a legitimate political goal. And so the idea of positive sum thinking, I think, is especially lacking. But so I was planning to talk more about the social cognitive elements in this, but after listening to everyone else in the panel, I think that really the main thing that I would like to focus on is how do we get there, or how do we make that step forward, right? So we all know that sort of, we talked already about what needs to happen, or what are the basic conditions or preconditions for effective TJ processes. And so the question is, but how do we get there? How do we reverse thinking? How do we reverse processes of dehumanization? How do we reverse, zero-sum narratives? This is, I mean, the main challenge that we're all facing. And especially at this time where these processes are actually going the other way, right? So towards more dehumanization rather than less of it. And so I think I would like to offer two answers to that question. And the first one, so a simple answer and a more complicated one. The simple one, I think, is external, because I think an option or a pathway for change is through external sanctions that would change the calculations of the parties, that would change the status quo and would make the status quo an impossible or an undesirable option anymore. And I think that's the simple answer, and I think it is valid and it's important. Now, the other more complicated answer relates to an internal one. So how do we shift views? How do we change processes of dehumanization that can allow that sort of internal healing or reconciliation processes? And I was thinking about this last year when I was doing a teaching at the Gaza Solidarity Encampment on my campus. And a Lebanese student came to me and asked, how did I change my views? What made me, who were for many years a Zionist Jew who served in the IDF, how did I make this transition to be able to really hear the Palestinian side and change my views about the conflict and open up to conversations that is not kind of combative in the sense that we have to defend, our own narrative. And I thought that my answer to that was that it was a very long process, right? It doesn't happen, immediately. Like it's not that someone can just open up. I think it's a step by step, and you're willing to hear more and more over sometimes many years, if not a lifetime. The other part of it was um, an exercise that I was doing. I was teaching negotiation at Stanford, and one of the exercises that I was playing with my students was exercises of attentive listening, where one student had to tell a story, and the other student had to just listen and allow the other one to just tell their story without interjecting their own ideas or judgment or suggestions. And, people fail that exercise on the first minute because it's really difficult to listen really without interjecting ourselves into it. And I think that practicing that while speaking to my Palestinian friends at Stanford in a kind of, in a place where we're on equal grounds, really helped me make that personal change to be able to really listen. And I think at the beginning I felt that resistance, but at the beginning I expressed it and then I expressed it less. And then I was able to actually pass kind of the attentive listening exercise. And at some point, the conversation was completely different. And I felt that my narratives are not as rigid as they once were. So I think there is a way to do that, but it's probably um, long and complex. And the conditions for that long and complex process are probably not right now in the midst of the horrible genocide and the terrible violence. And so I think it is definitely an ideal to start thinking about it at this point in time. But probably um, it would necessitate a combination of those external and internal processes. I'll end with that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shiri. I think these were eye-opening insights. I love how you brought your personal perspective and experience, and I think we can learn a lot from that. I'd like to move on a similar topic to our next speaker, Manal Totri Jubran. And Manal, you're an expert on Israeli constitutional law, Israeli human rights issues, on Arab-Jewish relations and perceptions within Israel and beyond. And I want to ask you against these expertise, how can we foster social ripeness for transitional justice among different parts of the Israeli society? So here we move a bit into the internal dimension. And I'd like to hear you, please, on that. I will have a second question. I will jump in and ask it when the time is right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for organizing this conference. It's very challenging to be the last one in such a great conference, but a bit long. So I'll try to have some new thoughts, but I will also connect a couple of things that already have been said. I also very much connect to Shira's contribution that the first and foremost act that has to be done is to stop this horrific genocidal war. Otherwise, I'm not sure that there will be someone to make TJ with. So I would like to begin by emphasizing that social ripeness required to initiate transitional justice processes in the context of Palestine-Israel conflict hinges on recognizing the unique and complex nature of this conflict, that unlike other past or ongoing conflicts that were mentioned before by Paulo and others, the Palestine-Israel situation makes the adaptation of existing transitional justice mechanisms a bit more challenging. And this distinctiveness, I think, would make us, or would be more necessary to develop and evolve an alternative framework and more context-sensitive approach to this unique conflict. So the conflict involves multiple Palestinian groups that were mentioned here, but without any sort of a clear conceptualization of these groups. So the Palestinian groups, each situated within different geopolitical realities, and who also possess distinct and different historical experiences and grievances. And these include, in my view, four basic groups that all compose the Palestinian people. But again, they have different experiences and different historical points. So the first one is the Palestinians in Gaza who are currently enduring an existential and potentially genocidal war, following, of course, years of repeated military assaults and siege. The second group is the Palestinians in the West Bank who live under conditions widely described as apartheid and who limited access to basic human rights. And then we have the Palestinians in the diaspora, comprising various groups also themselves. Some are still stateless, three generations of stateless Palestinians in the diaspora who mainly are positioned in Lebanon and Syria, but also elsewhere. Others do have citizenship, but also they have different dynamics and they evolve differently because some of them became citizens of Arab countries. So they stayed kind of connected to the Arab world and to the Palestinian people more than others who live in the EU or in the US and have developed other resources to connect to the conflict. And lastly, we have the Palestinian citizens of Israel who face systematic discrimination and exclusion, particularly in land allocation, education, and political representation. Of course, all the previous groups as well have suffered from land disposition and so on. Now, although all these groups are part of the Palestinian people, the traumatic rupture of the Nakba fragmented their belongingness in some sense, and each group has since developed different and distinct relationships with the Israeli society and with the Israeli state. So when we think about there are some shared discussions and collective processes that are essential, but there are also a critical need for differentiated mechanisms that acknowledge the specific atrocities and historical turning point and the lived realities of each group. And so in this context, transitional justice must be inclusive and pluralistic and grounded very much on the recognition of the layered identities, losses, and demands for justice that span the Palestinian experience. So something that was a bit missing for me in this webinar, and in general, when we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is this kind of a superficial talk about just one conflict, whereas in order to have a social ripeness for a more deep discussion about what's happening, and where are we going ahead with this Israeli conflict, Palestine-Israeli conflict? We have to narrow it down to these groups and these complexities, in my view.
This is really important what you're saying, and maybe the follow-up question would be, do we need to find a holistic way to treat all these layers and all these different dyads and groups and relationships, or can we pick a dyad here and work with it? Can we take, for example, Palestinians and Jews who have Israeli citizenship and start practicing somehow transitional justice on that level, and then sort of hope that that's a model that will, attract and include later on the other groups you mentioned?
Well, I'll address the group that I belong to, and I will talk also from a personal experience. I will take on Shira's a contribution on that. And I will focus on the Palestinian citizens inside of Israel, but still, I think that we could learn something from this model, but we have to also accommodate and think about models that would be also specified for the context. So when I talk about the Palestinians in Israel, as part of the broader Palestinian people, we are affected by multiple layers of this conflict. At the same time, we are directly impacted by the internal transformations within the Israeli society and state, but as well as other groups, but in very distinct ways. If, for example, the rise in crime within the Palestinian society inside Israel is just one of the manifestation of this complex dynamic that also differs from other dynamics, which again we could find some linking characters, but we have also distinctive characters. And this group, the Palestinian minority within Israel, maintains daily and direct interaction with the Israeli state, and it's deeply embedded within the Israeli civil society. And what I have experienced is that in the aftermath of the recent event, especially the judicial overhaul and the October 7th attack, we have witnessed various initiatives by new and existing NGOs aimed at reimagining this new future, this new social contract, or even some of them are even trying to draft a new constitution for Israel. And I have to say that they do have a very genuine try to include the Palestinians within Israel, but still many of these efforts remain anchored in a framework that defines the state as you already mentioned, the state as both Jewish and democratic, thereby preserving the existing power imbalances between the Jewish and the Palestinian citizens. More critically, they often ignore two central issues that are critical for any future that we think about, any joint future that we can talk about. The first one is the ongoing occupation and apartheid regime in the occupied territories. And the second one, of course, the atrocities currently unfolding in Gaza. So I had talks that they approached me to be part of their initiatives, initiatives like the Movement for Equality Government, the fourth quarter, Harivona. They don't mention at all the word occupation nor the atrocities in Gaza. Now, but we do have a Land for All. We do have Standing Together, who are doing an exceptional work, and they do address these issues. But again, most like mainstream initiatives that really genuinely think that they are building a decent future for Israel do not mention at all the war in Gaza or acknowledge the realities of occupation. And I have to tell you that this silence, this regardless is very upsetting for me. And I will take advantage of this stage here and just to apply to appeal directly to my fellow Jewish citizens who sincerely wish to build a shared future. You have to understand that we, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, are part of the Palestinian people. And we cannot talk about democracy. We cannot talk about the rule of law. We cannot talk about coexistence or any constitutional reform while our siblings in Gaza are being bombed, starved, and buried. At the same time, also our cousins are still hostages in Gaza. So any serious vision of a common future must reckon with the horror of the present and demand accountability. And I will conclude with one last sentence. People mentioned this before, and I would like to emphasize that transitional justice is not merely a theoretical framework, but it's truly a psychological and ethical necessity. And in order to begin to build a future together, I need to know, I have kind of a psychological need to know that my Jewish fellows, my Jewish colleagues recognize and acknowledge the atrocities that are happening now in Gaza and in the West Bank just yesterday. Just as I have devoted time and care to understand the suffering caused by the events of the 7th of October, I expect the same commitment in return. True solidarity and shared democracy requires nothing else than such commitment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manal. This was very sincere. And yeah, touches on an issue that really needed to be fleshed out. I wanted to thank you also for participating and all of the panel for participating. You had very, very, very meaningful contributions. We are well over time, so we don't really have time for another discussion. But I really would like us all to stay on the topic and have more on this. There's a lot to unpack. I think there is also potential because, every one of us started with the hopelessness of the situation, but forced to say something for 8 or 12 minutes, you came up with so much advice or a vision of what could and what is the seeds that are already there, if it is diaspora in Stanford or if it is, some of the organizations like Standing Together or Ziad's Journal, if it is even our group. So I would like to invite us as well as the audience to find ways to continue this discussion.